Hi, this is Pat Duckworth, the author of Hot Women Rock, How to Discover Your Midlife Entrepreneurial Mojo. And my guest today, I just know we haven't got enough time. You're going to be begging me to talk to her longer, but it is what it is. So my guest today is an international speaker, a healer, author, a consultant, master coach, and a frequent guest on radio, podcasts, and television, and you will understand why. She's the past president of the National Speakers Association and the founder of 4 companies. My guest is a psychotherapist and was in practice for over 25 years. And as a motivational speaker, she draws on so much life experience, but I'm not going to spoil it by telling you. My only spoiler alert is that you will be amazed. In the light of all of that, she's supported highly successful women from all levels of success. And she combines her recognition that mindset and communication skills set us apart. So I just can't wait to introduce you to Dr. Dorothy A Martin-Neville. Hi, Dorothy. How are you?
Oh, Pat, thank you so much. This is a thrill.
Well, you and I have only met virtually, so I'm really hoping that one day we'll be in the same room, because I've heard clips of your story and I just want to take you for a coffee and learn it all, really. Where do you want to start with your story?
Well, we're looking at my career, so we'll start at that. Many years ago, 30 years ago now, God willing, I was a young child. I had just got out of grad school and was invited by one of my professors he was a psychiatrist, into his practice. He was going to be opening up a therapy practice, and my graduate degree was in psychology and psychotherapy. And so I started my career at that point. I mean, I had done other things previously. I had been in social work. I had been an international airline stewardess. I had done many things prior. But then I got married, had children, and now, if you will, I was beginning my adult life, the next stage of my adult life. I opened up a private practice with him, eventually broke out. I felt constrained, and I broke out and had a private practice for 17 more years as a psychotherapist, and absolutely loved it. About 3 years in, I was blessed with 42 patients a week. I had a 6-month waiting list that lasted for 17 years till I left the country. I truly believe that when you do what you love, when you're filled with passion and you're loving it, people are drawn to your passion and your vibrancy. And you're doing what you came here to do when you're filled with that excitement. And people want to be around that, hoping it's infectious. And hopefully it is, and we can encourage others to do the same.
So what drew you in? Let me just go back a bit. What drew you into psychotherapy in the first place?
Well, I grew up in an orphanage, and I was later adopted and raised in the inner city in the housing projects. And I was adopted when I was 3 and not allowed to live in my home because I was illegitimate, and it was theoretically a good Irish home. And good Irish Catholics didn't want illegitimate children. So I was raised outside in a playpen from 5:30 in the morning to 9:30 at night. And eventually, after my grandmother, who most did not want me in the home, went to bed, I was brought in, given dinner, put to bed, and got out again at 5:30 in the morning. So my grandmother never saw an illegitimate child in her home. Wow. And when she was 6, broke a hip, was placed in a nursing home, and I was then able to live full-time in the house. At that point, I found out that my father was an extremely violent alcoholic, and there were numerous issues. And because I had lived outside, I think I came in with a different perspective. I hadn't been a part of this family, so I think I could see it. I was a wise 6-year-old child. I could see I didn't know the words then, but I could see the dynamics. I could understand what was going on and realize they were all hurting. They were all good people who were hurting. And from that point on, I truly worked to help people become more empowered, become happy, to begin to see that they could do anything they wanted if they truly wanted it. And so here I was, 6, 7, 8 years old, encouraging my mother to find what she loved, to find something that made her happy and go do it. As I was doing it with other women in the projects, it's where I grew up was a very small Irish Catholic ghetto, literally, and encouraging these women to come alive and and find dreams and go for it. And I knew I wanted something very big in life, bigger than this, and didn't know what that was, but knew I wanted something bigger. So eventually I moved on, and my only way out, I went to an unaccredited inner city high school, so I couldn't go to college, couldn't go to nursing school. So from my perspective, my only way out was to become a Catholic nun. So I became a Catholic nun for a number of years, and as Sister James Marie, I was a social worker. I was sent to college and became a social worker, and eventually left religious life and came back out into the world to see what it was like out here in the world, and realized it was a huge world I knew nothing about. So I moved to Manhattan and became an international airline stewardess. And so I flew over 1,000,000 miles as a stewardess and saw many, many countries and loved it. Eventually got married and had children. And 15 years later, I was divorced, and I needed to find a way to support my children.
Oh.
So I decided to go back into therapy, and as a patient as well as in training, and look at where I wanted to go with my life, what I wanted to do. These were long before the days of coaching. And realized I'd loved people in the same way I had always done. So I went on and got my master's as a therapist, and joined Dick's expanding practice and became a therapist, and eventually at my own. And I was on my own for about 3 years and realized, although I had many patients and I had two children who were in the first grade and in fifth, that I wanted more. And so I went and studied and became certified in 9 methods of integrative healthcare, and acupressure and reflexology and iridology and on and on. And eventually, with my waiting list, many of my potential patients knew each other, and they asked me to teach them what I know. But when you grow a lot and you're always growing and changing, you don't know what you know.
Yeah.
You integrate the knowledge, and integrated knowledge becomes wisdom, and that becomes transformational. So it becomes who you are. It doesn't become what you know. It's who you are, the person you become. So I had become a healer without even knowing what that word meant.
Yeah.
And so when they asked me, I decided, okay, I'll open up a 10-week program in self-healing through the energy field, and did that, and it went really well. And they asked me to open up a school, so I opened up a 2-year program. And about 60% of my student body were physicians, nurses, occupational therapists, massage therapists, physical therapists, and 40% were lay people. They were carpenters, bankers, lawyers, housewives, waitresses. And there was this eclectic mix, a wonderful, wonderful mix of people. And at the end of 2 years, they didn't want to graduate. So they asked me to make it a 3-year program. So I had a 3-year program for about 9 years. And eventually my little ones went off to college. I left the country and I moved to Anguilla in the British West Indies. And I lived there for 10 years. But at that point, in the United States, I had 3 companies. So I had wonderful executive directors running my company. And every day I would call the States and we would talk, and they would fax me the bills, and I organized and did that. And really, I knew when my youngest left that I had been what the world would call highly successful. I had my private practice, and I was speaking at the time. And Wayne Dyer, who used to be a man really big in personal growth, Wayne and I had the same agent here on the East Coast. And so when she was booking Wayne, she'd book me. And so we would be back to back. One night, he may go first this night, and I would go the next night. And sometimes I would go first, and he would go the next night. And we would speak. So I was speaking, and I had been seeing the patients, and I had the school. And I had been teaching. They asked me to teach in grad school, so I taught several courses in grad school. And at that point, my school was growing so much that one of my graduates, who had become the assistant head of cardiology at a hospital here in Connecticut, asked if I would help him open up an integrative health department at his hospital. And he had graduated from my school, so he wanted my school, which he thought was the equivalent of a medical school or a nursing school, to be the basis of providing the practitioners who would work in the integrative health department. So I made it a 4-year program, and now all of my students in the 3rd and 4th years are required to do medical internships. And I, without realizing it, became a pioneer in the field of integrative healthcare. So it sounds like we're all over the place, but it truly was progressive. There was social work as Sister James Marie, and then an airline stewardess, and then private practice as a therapist, and then my school. And my school, I was blessed, became so successful. Students are flying in from Canada and all over the United States to study with me. And because now they had to do medical internships, I was no longer the sole teacher. The school became way too big. So it ended up, instead of this little thing that I was doing on the side because patients had asked me to, it now became an institute. And I ended up with 30 teachers on my payroll. I had 16 preceptors seeing all the medical internships across the country, and 9 office staff, and offering medical and dental and 401k match. And all of a sudden realized I'm an institution. And our work was so effective, some hospitals wanted to give us grant funding to research my work. So, and they wanted to give it to a nonprofit. So I opened a nonprofit so that they could do it that way. And so before I knew it, I ended up with all of these companies that just kept expanding. And at some point, it was just too much.
And so you had all this amazing skill on the professional side. How did you develop those business skills to support that?
Well, some of that, I dare say, was it has to be divine intervention, because, the thing is, many of my friends, I'm a PhD, and many of my friends who were physicians, who were lawyers, who were psychologists, we never got Business 101. They gave us all of these great big grant advanced degrees, but we never learned a thing about business. And so much of what I did was trial and error. And how do you do this? How do you develop a private practice? You learn how to work with insurance companies. How do you open a school? It was a wonderful school for many years until it became so successful. The Department of Higher Education wanted to get involved, the State Department of Higher Education. So now all of a sudden I had to be approved by the Department of Higher Education in Connecticut. And they forced me to grow as an institute if I was going to be allowed to stay open. And so I hired a business consultant to come in and help me run the company. I hired vice president. Somebody said you should, have somebody help with marketing. I hired a vice president of marketing and business development. And I hired somebody to develop the curriculum in a way that was more structured than what I had offered. And I think need kept calling me to develop, and I could see when there were too many students that I really couldn't give them all the one-on-one attention I wanted, that it was time to train some of my graduates to teach at my school. So need kept calling me at that point. Yeah. I'm much smarter a businesswoman at this point than I was then. But certainly, if you can get business classes, if you can get business support, if you can go wild and get an MBA, you're far ahead of the game. But many of us, you learn as you go, and that's not always the smoothest and cheapest way to do it, but you learn as you go. I'm not one that hesitates to ask for help. Not one at all that hesitates to ask when I don't know.
That's an important point, isn't it? Being willing and able to ask for help.
You've got to be absolutely humble as you go through this journey, because no matter how much you know in one arena, there's going to be other arenas where you know little to nothing. Yeah. And if you're not asking for help, this one skill set isn't going to truly allow you to be fully present on the planet. Yeah. So always bringing in great accountants, and growing up where I did, the only people who had lawyers to bail them out of jail. Yeah. And now all of a sudden I'm in this other world where I've got 4 lawyers, I've got copyright lawyers, I've got employee lawyers, I've got business lawyers. But my goodness, I laughed more than once at how none of my lawyers were to get me out of jail. That it was a whole new world that I was living in.
So did we get to the end of where you are now, or was there the next stage? So the school.
With the next stage, when, as I said, I moved to Anguilla and I lived there for 10 years. When I came back to America, I realized our culture had changed dramatically. Mm-hmm. That my students for 14, 15 years, because I had my school for 19 years, for 14, 15 years, my students came in desiring to grow. 50%, it was a 4-year program that I offered, and 50% of the curriculum was on personal growth. Because I truly don't believe you can help others heal if you haven't done your own healing. Yeah. And so there was a lot of deep, intensive spiritual and psychological growth that took place within my school structure. And then the afternoons were based on learning healing techniques I developed to work with different types of cancers, to work with autoimmune disorders and so forth. And so it was very pragmatic as well as spiritual growth. But when I came back to America, I realized the culture had changed and the self-entitlement was massive. And that was such a shock to me, coming from a culture where when I moved there, the average annual income was $3,000 to $4,000 US. We worked with EC, Eastern Caribbean monies, and so in EC dollars, it was the equivalent of $3,000 or $4,000 US. And when I came back to America, it was a completely different culture. And students no longer wanted to do personal growth; they just wanted that certificate, because I was the only school in the United States that was a healing school affiliated with hospitals across the country, and they wanted to come to get a piece of paper so that they could get insurance reimbursements. And that's not why I opened up my school. I opened it up to help people evolve and become the best self they could be. Because I truly believe when you become your best self, and this is a process, we're not done to the day we go home, but when you're in process, you have the ability to empathically and skill-wise pull people along. And I no longer wanted to teach people who just wanted a piece of paper. And so eventually the school closed. And when I came back, the field of coaching had developed that had never existed. And first I was angry. I thought it's for people who didn't want to be bothered getting an MA or a PhD or any of those things. And thought, boy, they're too lazy or cheap to get qualifications. And I thought, whenever there's something you don't like, you best explore it, because it's really about you. It's not about that, unless it's cruelty or something. It's about you, not them. So I went and knew it was my stuff. So I studied with a woman who had actually been the head of Tony Robbins' coaching development program for years. She opened up her own coaching program, studied with her for a year in Marina Del Rey in California, flew out there and studied a week at a time, and became a coach, and recognized I was still doing therapy 1 or 2 days a week. But most of the men and women who were coming to see me truly weren't looking for therapy any longer. I think as we grow, our client changes, our client base changes. They were really executives who had no idea how to coach, how to lead, how to own their leadership skills, and how to lead others. And I ended up closing my practice and becoming an executive leadership coach, supporting them learning how to own their leadership, to really claim that humbly, but to claim that leadership isn't about becoming a dictator. Leadership is about bringing the best out of others so they move into their own leadership. And I just continued to do that. And eventually, as it is with therapy, the vast majority of my clients were women. And so I started developing, an expertise, if you will, as an executive leadership coach for women, supporting them going to the next level. So as a speaker getting out there, I spoke for years on motivational speaking, that anything is possible, because my life proved that. I then started speaking on leadership, because that really was where my heart and soul was at the time, and it still is. And with that, as I spoke on that, I would get phone calls from people in the audience. Would you take me on as a private client? One woman was CEO of a company on Wall Street, and she had been wonderfully successful at her company, but eventually it was bought out, and she was now the head of the American division of a global organization. And she still saw herself as this kind of a leader. So becoming this kind of a leader was overwhelming. And so I could help her, because I was blessed with having all of these companies behind me. I was easy to help her what to insource, what to outsource, how to develop leaders and so forth. But I realized the biggest difficulty for her was increasing her energetic footprint to such a place that she could walk through this world as the president of the American division of a global organization. That was an identity that was extremely difficult for her to own. And I find that more and more, whether I'm working with a small entrepreneur startup in Maine, in a little town, or Wall Street, it doesn't matter, or a woman now who's the president of a hospital. Growing into a bigger us, a bigger presence of us, seems to be extremely difficult. And I notice how women betray themselves and how men betray themselves. So actually, I've just written my 7th book.
I can't wait for you to tell what the title of this is, but I'm just going to stop you there for a moment and say this is Pat talking to Dr. Dorothy Martin-Neville, and we're talking about coaching and inspirational speaking and psychotherapy and all sorts of things today. And I just want to say that whole thing about growing into a different identity is something that I talk about a lot on Hot Women Rock, because in my view, when women get to midlife, often they've had that identity as a carer, a supporter, you know, somebody who's perhaps looked after children, who's supported a partner, who's been, and then grows into caring for older parents. And then gets to midlife, gets to menopause, realizes that the clock's ticking quite fast now, and then goes, who am I? Who did I want to be? Was there a bigger vision? And that flipping identity from going from that supporter carer to growing into who you really are is a massive change. And I think it can be so exciting and so energizing. And I wanted to say that before we move on to the next.
But that's so important, Pat. It's you're bringing a phenomenal message. I mean, you truly are a much needed messenger. And the fact that you have this show and you can do it in 100 different ways, because that's a message that needs to get across. And women as natural nurturers can get lost in the nurturing. Yes. Because unfortunately what ends up happening is they nurture the world and forget to nurture themselves.
Yeah. So we're going to go on now and talk about your book, because this is going to be so important. Tell us about it. I know you've already written 7, so let's move on to the next one.
This current one, the 7th one that's about ready to be released, is Real Women Change the World. Letting the good girl die so the real woman can live.
Yes.
And that really speaks to what you were just talking about, that when we are so involved in nurturing everybody in our lives that we forget us, we end up doing everything we think others want us to do. We end up becoming who we think others want us to become. And sadly, my experience is that so frequently women either never knew who they were as individual entities, or did but lost it in the process of loving. That we, having been raised to never make, as the good girl, to never offend anybody, to never make anybody uncomfortable, to never make waves, to never say anything that's too out of the box, we learned how to create a tighter and tighter and tighter container. And when we can support women, not only breaking through that container, but forgetting the container ever existed, that they just get without limit to become who they are meant to be, we're now reconnecting them to their passion, to their vibrancy, to their aliveness. And I believe to their soul's purpose. I believe every one of us came in here with a life purpose, with a soul purpose. And part of that is so that we can bring ourselves out, so that we're taught, especially in the Western culture, we're taught to live from our brain. We're taught to live from logic. And some can go to the other extreme and they become completely emotional and they forget about balance. So we can be off balance. And unfortunately, many women are seen as the emotional ones who are out of balance. And the overreaction is to try to become more male and more didactic and more just dictatorial and making things happen. When the balance there is to allow our heart and our soul out, and to come from our soul's essence, to come from the truth of who we honestly in all authenticity are. And if we do that, we recognize they were all so infinitely powerful. So coming from our authenticity, coming from our heart and coming from our soul does not for one single second mean coming from a place of powerlessness. Yeah. It means that I get my power from my authenticity. And that as I learn, and as an educator, we're not going into that, we don't need to go back there, but having taught in graduate school for years and then having taught in medical school for years, and I was co-chair of a multi-million-dollar grant UConn Medical School received, and I was overseeing energy medicine research across the country. With all of that and so much more, what we see is that we can end up not only disappearing, but not finding that place that is our authentic self infinitely powerful. And in that infinite power, in that vulnerability, and in that balance between emotion and dictatorial power, the infinite power we possess is transformational, so that all the education we receive, all the education I shared with my students, education is useless if it isn't transformational. If it is simply knowledge that sits in our brain, it serves no purpose. If we take in all of this knowledge and we integrate it on a cellular level, it becomes wisdom. And once it becomes wisdom, not only does it transform us, it supports us in transforming all those we work with. And we begin to recognize that that transformation is what this whole journey is about.
Dorothy, what is your purpose? Can you sum it up in a few sentences?
If I were to sum up my purpose, I believe it is to support the transformation of this planet and of the people I meet. I haven't practiced religion in years, but I'm very spiritual. And I truly believe that for myself, my calling is to remind people this is a spiritual journey, and that our values need to be, if they're going to be authentically ours, they need to be spiritual values of authenticity, of empathy, of really giving a hand up to all those we meet. It needs to be values that really support the betterment. And I don't mean that in terms of success and money and value, and all of that is wonderful, but we need to bring this over to that. We need to bring our values so that our financial success, our business success is really a byproduct of living those core values that call us to be the most embodied soul or embodied essence. It doesn't matter to me what the word is. That embodied essence is really where we come from. And I think my message is that. And because of my background in medicine, my desire at this point truly is to change medicine, especially here in America, where we can bring the heart and soul back into patient care. Because when patients come into hospitals, they are most vulnerable.
Yeah.
You know, it doesn't matter if they've cut their finger, they're frightened they're going to be losing their arm. Fear steps in and they become more vulnerable. And if they're just a number, if they're just more income for us, the heart and soul isn't touched.
Yeah, I mean, you know that I work with women going through menopause and the symptoms they're experiencing, and mine is very much a mind-body approach. And I think sometimes women look at it and think, well, don't I just need a tablet or something? And of course, what's going on in their heads and their emotions at this time is what's influencing their experience of it. And
Right.
it's get that message over that if we can sort out what's going on in your head and with your emotions, we can make this a much better experience. So I'm totally down with you on all of that.
Oh my God.
So yeah, what does success mean for you now?
Success for me means living my purpose.
Yeah.
I feel vibrantly alive when I know I'm making a difference on the planet. When I know that I'm supporting others coming into their own, that brings me into my own. So this isn't self-sacrifice here. This isn't martyrdom at all. The more I can support others coming into their own, the more alive and vibrant I feel.
Yeah.
And so to me, that's success.
Fantastic. If you had one tip, I'm sure you've got millions, but one tip for women who are just making this change into entrepreneurship, what would you say to them?
Do it as a powerful human being. Do not tentatively do anything. I believe absolutely in mindfulness practice or meditation or prayer, whatever word works for you. Come from that place. Go back and remember who you truly are. Bring that power out. It's so much better to apologize than ask permission, as they say. You know, take a risk. If we don't risk, if we don't claim our power to risk, no business we have as an entrepreneur will succeed. Being an entrepreneur requires risk after risk, calculated risk, intelligent risk. Don't go making $1 million loan to open up some company when you have no clue what you're doing. Take logical risks and get help. But you've got to be willing to be powerful, to take risks, and to recognize that if your company is going to be successful, it has to reflect the best of who you are.
Yeah, Definitely, and who you authentically are. Make
Yeah,
sure that business is authentically who you are.
absolutely.
So, people watching, if they want to find out more about you, how can they do that?
They could go to my website, askdrdorothy.com, or they could drop me an email at dorothy@askdrdorothy.com.
Fantastic. And give us the title of your new book again.
The new book is Real Women Change the World, Letting the Good Girl Die So the Real Woman Can Live.
Just love it. And when can we expect that to be out?
I'm hoping to launch it on March 8th, which is International Women's Day.
Okay, so viewers of Hot Women Rock, you can expect me to put up a link when the book's out so that you can dive in and get your copy, because it's going to be amazing. Thank
Thanks.
you so much, Dr. Dorothy. It's been such a pleasure talking to you. What have I learned from today? I've learned that all of those experiences in life build up. They're all part of who you are and what you can share with the world. And you know, we have to keep learning, but that knowledge can't just sit there. It's about sharing it, integrating it so that it becomes wisdom. And that's whatever you are as an entrepreneur, that is all important to you. So thank you for your story. Thank you for all of your wisdom. And to all of our viewers, keep watching out for more of these interviews with amazing entrepreneurs. I'll see you next time.
Thank you.